Good afternoon and welcome to the 12th Annual Sentinel Initiative Public Workshop. I'm Mark McClellan. I'm the director of the Duke Margolis Center for Health Policy at Duke, and very pleased to have you with us for this first virtual edition of the Sentinel Annual Public Workshop. This year's event stands to be a memorable discussion that we hope will add to the commitment, the activities, and the resolve and participation of the stakeholder community to improve public health through the FDA Sentinel Initiative. This initiative has become a major part of FDA's post-market safety monitoring programs. It provides FDA with real-time access to unique insights and evidence regarding the adoption and experience with medical products using data and methods that continue to get richer and better developed. The resources and capabilities of Sentinel, which have made it one of the largest distributed data networks for medical product safety in the world, are possible as a result of all of these partnerships across the public and private sectors. It really is a true public-private collaboration. And the agency is working to continue to strengthen its already substantial investment in these partnerships, as well as the data sources and the innovative analytic tools that make up the evolving Sentinel program. This year, we'll talk about how Sentinel is building on its strategic plan, which is a key topic at last year's workshop. We'll hear about how CDER, the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, is implementing a plan that modernizes the Sentinel system, as well as many new activities underway at CBER, the Biologics Center at FDA, to enhance the BEST initiative, the complementary activities that are taking place related to biologics evidence development in the post-market setting. And while there continues to be a need for timely evidence on medical products that these programs are fulfilling, we've seen some new developments in the course of the COVID pandemic that have shown the value of Sentinel as a true national resource for timely evidence beyond safety surveillance as well. So as part of today's discussion, we'll consider the contribution Sentinel has made to the growing body of evidence for COVID-19 in support of research across the whole infection and care pathway, including prevention, diagnosis, treatment, and patient recovery. Over this past decade plus, the growth of Sentinel from a pilot project to core safety surveillance program, and increasingly as a national resource for driving evidence generation related to healthcare and health, provides a timely opportunity for us to take stock of where we've been, the past achievements, these expanding current strategic uses, as well as future directions. We're going to talk about that before we finish today with FDA's Deputy Principal Commissioner, Amy Abernethy. So we've got a lot to cover in today's discussion. Before we get started, I wanted to quickly review and reiterate some virtual workshop logistic considerations and housekeeping. These sorts of things should be getting familiar to most of us by now. During today's virtual workshop, we're going to have a group of speakers providing remarks and discuss in each of our sessions. Additionally, we want your participation. At the end of each session, we're going to have some time to address questions that you submit. And there are a couple of ways to submit a question. As in the past, you can email us at margolisevents@duke.edu. That's margolisevents@duke.edu. Another method we're using today is called Slido. So on the right side of your screen, you'll see a Q&A module in which you can submit questions directly throughout the meeting. And if for some reason you don't see the Q&A module on your screen, you can go to slido.com, enter #Sentinel in the event code field on the left side of your screen there. And once you're signed in, you'll be able to participate in the Q&A directly through that mechanism. So just simple as going to slido.com and then entering #Sentinel, and it'll take you through participation from there if you don't see it already from the link that you used to get into the workshop this afternoon. We're going to have a recording of this workshop available on the Duke Margolis website after the event. Because we are recording, we want to remind all of our speakers to check that your camera and microphone are in the right settings before you start. If you have any difficulty activating your microphone before speaking, Our production partner may activate it or deactivate it for you. So be aware that you've got help there. And we encourage all of you to engage, to react on Twitter to the workshop today and the topics we're discussing, the hashtag Sentinel Initiative. You might also consider mentioning our account at Duke Margolis, and we invite you to follow the Duke Margolis Twitter account and join the conversation online that we'll be contributing to there as well. So that's going to get us started, and let's get going. I'm pleased to kick off this meeting with remarks from the acting director of the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at FDA, Dr. Patrizia Cavazzoni. She'll deliver our keynote address. Patrizia, thanks so much for taking time today. I know you all are extremely busy with COVID response and everything else.
Good afternoon, Mark. Thank you for the kind introduction. Sorry for not being able to use video today. I am very pleased to provide some opening remarks for this meeting. I would like to welcome all of you and thank you to the 12th Annual Sentinel Public Workshop. This year has brought unprecedented challenges to the world, our nation, and FDA. The pandemic reaffirms the value of ensuring that FDA has strong public-private partnership and robust research capabilities. Now, in its 12th year of operation, FDA's Sentinel Initiative continues to illustrate not just the potential for real-world data to answer important and urgent public health problems, but how this partnership has helped expand FDA's use of real-world data sources, instilled confidence in evidence generation for FDA decision-making, and led to the development of the largest, most sophisticated post-market drug safety system in the world. While Sentinel is critical for routine operations, having a versatile and ready medical data enterprise system like Sentinel is even more important during a public health emergency. You'll hear later today how FDA leveraged Sentinel's rapid analytic platform to monitor drugs used to treat patients diagnosed with COVID-19, and how it was used to address several outstanding questions about COVID-19 disease severity and its impact on blood clotting. Also, you will hear how we stood up an evidence generation platform using both existing and novel EHR data sources to generate early descriptive results within months of the pandemic declaration back in March 2020, while also launching more rigorous natural history studies on pregnancy and coagulopathy outcomes that are ongoing. So FDA's investment in pharmacoepidemiology and drug safety thus far has paid enormous dividends by blazing the trail for real-world data analytics and producing important insights on its strengths and limitations. It has allowed us to explore and create new methods like tree scan for signal detection, optical character recognition for chart review, and natural language processing to help structure free text in electronic health records for faster and more rigorous outcome validation. Maintaining the public's trust and improving the capabilities of FDA's evidence system is vital. FDA's leadership understands that excellence can only come through smart, consistent, and strategic investments in real-world data sources and in novel methods. Last year, at the annual meeting, we outlined our approach to achieve these goals in the Sentinel Strategic System Plan. In the fall of 2019, we launched the third Sentinel 5-year contract to implement that strategy. The Sentinel Operations Center remains the focal point for conducting analysis of important safety questions in a rigorous and efficient manner to generate evidence that FDA uses when making important regulatory decisions. Through its Sentinel Catalyst arm, the Sentinel Operations Center continues to support exciting projects like the IMPACT AFib trial and the My Studies app to support randomized trials by providing secure and remote electronic consent. You'll hear more about this from Rich Platt, the Sentinel system lead, later in the program. To support the continued success of the Sentinel Operations Center, we expanded the Sentinel system to include the two new Sentinel centers, the Sentinel Innovation Center and the Community Building and Outreach Center. The Sentinel Innovation Center is dedicated to continuing our commitment to advancing the core basic sciences of epidemiology, statistical inference, and advanced analytics such as machine learning and natural language processing. You'll hear later on about the master plan to harness these new technologies to build a new EHR data network. We also launched a community building and outreach center to improve our stakeholder engagement and ensure that Sentinel continues to act as a national and global resource. You'll hear about this new center's vision for generating awareness of broader uses of the Sentinel Common Data Model and publicly available toolkit, and our plans to capitalize and nurture the scientific community's intense interest in big data, health informatics, and data sciences to advance the Sentinel system. From the very beginning, Sentinel's success has been a function of the dynamic and mutually affirming public-private partnership within FDA and the scientific community. From the very first data partners who raised their hands to contribute their data to the nation's first national active drug safety surveillance system, to all the academic partners who developed the initial versions of the Common Data Model and Causal Inference tools, partnerships that have been essential to Sentinel's success. We anticipate that the Community Building and Outreach Center will help us continue to build on this tradition of partnership that are such critical ingredient for the future of Sentinel. FDA's role in prioritizing regulatory science areas, identifying use cases, and shaping trends in real-world data analytics is critical to this public-private partnership. Public trust in evidence generation is built on data quality, fitness for purpose, and careful study design. Rigorous application of these principles helps us ensure the Sentinel system remains a model for generating actionable evidence. In the end, we rely on the community's unwavering commitment and participation in FDA's public health mission and in the Sentinel system. I want to thank all of you for coming to the 12th annual public workshop and hope that it inspires you to continue to partner with us. If you've been with us for the journey, or join us as new collaborators in the future. Thank you.
Patrizia, thank you very much for your remarks and for that emphasis both on the new, the really interesting, important new developments with Sentinel, and also just how much it depends on community partnership and participation. So we'll come back to those themes, I'm sure, during the course of our upcoming sessions. Right now, I'd like to get us started on our first session on a robust Sentinel system for the 21st century, building right off Patrizia's remarks. We're going to hear from key Sentinel system leaders at FDA, as well as the leaders of those new Sentinel system coordinating centers that Patrizia mentioned, to discuss how this structure is going to add to and extend the vision laid out in the Sentinel system strategic plan that was published last year. And we'll also hear from our participants about opportunities within this new structure for new kinds and stronger kinds of stakeholder collaboration and engagement, as well as improved access to new data sources and tools to support robust safety surveillance activities. I'm very pleased to welcome our four panelists. They include Robert Ball, who's the Deputy Director of the Office of Surveillance and Epidemiology at the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at FDA. And second, Rich Platt, who's been here since the beginning. He's Professor and Chair of the Harvard Medical School Department of Population Medicine and President of the Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare Institute. He's the Principal Investigator of the FDA Sentinel system. Next, Dr. Sebastian Schneewicz, who is professor of medicine and epidemiology at Harvard Medical School and chief of the Division of Pharmacoepidemiology in the Department of Medicine at Brigham and Women's Hospital. He's also the principal investigator of the Fda Sentinel Innovation Center and methods lead for the Fda Sentinel program. And then also pleased to welcome Asif Dar, who is Vice Chairman and U.S. Life Sciences and Healthcare Industry Leader from Deloitte LLP. He's currently the Principal Investigator for the FDA's Sentinel Community Building and Outreach Center. So Asif, very happy to have you with us too. We're going to begin with remarks from Bob.
Thanks, Mark. Could I have the next slide, please? So I just want to begin at the beginning, just with a reminder of where we've come from with the Sentinel Initiative. So of course it begins back in 2007 with the passage of the FDA Amendment Act and the launching of the Mini Sentinel pilot in 2009, reaching several milestones along the way, and with the launching of the full Sentinel system in 2016. And we've been operating the Sentinel system for the past 4 years, and the system has contributed to many regulatory decisions and around important safety issues. In 2019, we put out our Sentinel strategic plan and then launched a new Sentinel contract, which I'll be talking about now. Next slide, please. So in January of 2019, we announced the Sentinel strategic plan to promote a new Sentinel system approach. Next slide. Some of the key messages from the strategic plan included that we wanted to maintain and enhance the foundation of the system, preserving FDA's long-term investment in the analysis tools and data infrastructure, including the Sentinel Common Data Model. Next. But we also wanted to diversify data sources, especially moving into electronic health records and claims linked to electronic health records. One of the things that we learned in the 4 years of running the full Sentinel system was areas where the active risk identification analysis component of Sentinel, or ARIA, was not sufficient to analyze certain safety questions. And that's really what's been driving our approach to improving the access to data that we need to improve outcomes and other aspects of study design. Part of that was also to incorporate advanced analytics, including natural language processing and machine learning, with focus on improving outcome validation. Next slide. And importantly, we wanted to broaden the touch points for participating in Sentinel's development to include the larger community. Next slide. And to establish a Sentinel scientific community that would help us disseminate the knowledge broadly to make Sentinel a national resource. Next. So in launching the new Sentinel contract in October of 2019, the key aspect of that was the creation of this new Sentinel system structure. At the heart of it, of course, is the Sentinel Operations Center, which would continue to conduct all the analyses and also to enhance the infrastructure so that FDA would have access to that improved data resource. To advance the science, the Sentinel Innovation Center was created to help us understand how best to do things like access and create a queryable EHR system, how to use these advanced analytic approaches such as NLP and machine learning, how to improve our causal inference approaches. And last but not least, the new contract created the Community Building and Outreach Center to fully engage the community in ways that we couldn't do easily in the previous structure. And so you'll be hearing in more detail from the leaders of all those centers today. Next slide. So that's it for my introduction, and I'm going to turn it back over to Mark, thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks very much for that overview, Bob. And next we're going to hear from Rich Platt. Rich?
Okay, thanks. Thank you so much. I'm going to spend my few minutes highlighting the evolution that's taken place in the Sentinel Operations Center since our meeting last year, because it's been a busy year, moving us in the direction that Patricia and Bob have described. Next slide, please. I'll focus on good, thanks. I'll focus on 4 areas where we've made substantial progress shown on this slide, and I'll close by mentioning 5 takeaways. So if you could move us ahead now, please. In terms of sort of direct support of FDA's mission, particularly around ARIA, next slide, we substantially increased the list of participating organizations. This is the collaborating organization slide that I showed at last year's meeting. And now take a look at the next slide. A much larger number of organizations are part of the Operations Center. And many of the new organizations are ones that have electronic health record data and substantial expertise in using it for the kinds of studies that are of interest to us. The other added organizations are ones that bring deep methodologic or content expertise. Next slide, please. Together, hundreds of people have contributed to building the current Sentinel distributed database. Patricia said that it's the largest electronic health database for these kinds of studies, which I believe is true. More remarkable, I think, is the fact, or 2 facts. One, that we have direct access to full medical records, to the clinicians who cared for patients, and to the patients themselves. Additionally, every time we refresh the data, it is extensively quality checked and curated so that it's possible to address a large array of questions that FDA brings without having to do additional cleaning or to prepare the data. We're now in a position where we can answer many questions using essentially push-button tools. However, most of the things that FDA engages us to do, in fact, take weeks or months, and that is time spent applying best scientific methods to the best fit-for-purpose data using high-quality clinical expertise. So most of the time that goes into executing our studies is devoted to the thinking that goes on between FDA scientists and Sentinel investigators. Next, please. These are some of the ways that FDA has used Sentinel work to support its regulatory decision making in the last year or so. Next slide, please. With FDA's leadership, we have built a multinational distributed data set so that it is possible. We are on the verge of doing our first study in 4 countries, partnering with the Canadian CNODE system, the UK's Clinical Practice Research Dataset, and the Danish National Patient Register. Each of these organizations has put their data into Sentinel Common Data Model format. A single program can be distributed and executed without modification. Next slide, please. In work beyond ARIA, we have been participating in FDA's real-world evidence program for quite some time. Next slide, please. And Patricia mentioned the My Studies mobile app. This is a patient-facing smartphone app that allows us to collect information directly from patients and link it with their medical records. This is designed partly to support pragmatic trials, and there are now 2 trials in the field that are supported by the PCORI, the Patient-Centered Outcome Research Institute. This app can also do e-consenting. And so next slide, please. As it became apparent that there would be many COVID trials that needed the ability to remotely consent patients, we created a COVID version of My Studies that is now being used to support a substantial handful of clinical trials. Next slide, please. The Impact AFib study that Patricia also mentioned is an embedded pragmatic clinical trial, 80,000 patients, 5 health plans. The trial came to a successful conclusion this year. It was presented as a late breaker at an international cardiology meeting. We'll have it in print fairly soon, but it's a success that has provided a foundation to launch additional embedded trials. Next slide. FDA has been prescient in putting Sentinel into a position that it could help respond to a pandemic. With the Office of Counterterrorism and Emerging Threats, we had spent several years putting work in with our partners at HCA Healthcare to be able to use data from 140 of their hospitals to evaluate the healthcare needs of people affected by a pandemic. That work paid off handsomely when it became important to be able to monitor the number and condition of people hospitalized with COVID, to characterize their clinical course, the treatment they received, and their outcomes. Next slide, please. And we're currently providing a substantial amount of information on an ongoing basis to FDA about COVID and about the utilization of medications, which are increasingly in short supply. Next slide, please. We continue to build our national collaborations, the work with the Reagan-Udall IMEDS Foundation, Reagan-Udall Foundation IMEDS program, and the Biologic and Biosimilars Collective Intelligence Consortium. This past year, for the first time, the Centers for Disease Control has become a repeat user of Sentinel. And this year, the NIH awarded its first pragmatic clinical trial grant to an investigator who proposed to build on the Impact AFib platform. Next slide, please. We've spent a considerable amount of work bringing EHRs into Sentinel. Next slide, please. Each of these organizations, HCA Healthcare, IBM Watson, Veridigm, and Trinetics, have already proven very useful in our response to COVID. We're bringing the PCORnet sites on board now. As part of this process, we're doing a substantial amount of work to enhance our common data model to be able to accommodate patient-reported outcomes, to develop and apply computable phenotypes, to be able to use unstructured data, to be able to validate conditions of interest. Next slide, please. We are already applying additional advanced analytics to the repertoire that we had been using, particularly around signal detection and distributed regression techniques. Next slide, please. Which takes me to the takeaways. This has been a year of building on the first 10 years of progress to develop new partnerships, to develop new data sources with a particular focus on EHRs, to implement new analytic methods, to enhance our ability to rapidly analyze our extensively quality check data, and to enhance our ability to recommend and apply the highest quality epidemiologic methods to assess causal relationships. Thanks very much.
Rich, thanks very much for covering a lot of ground there, a lot of developments this year. I look forward to discussing a little further, but right now I'd like to turn to Sebastian.
Thank you, Mark. Next slide, please. So I'm going to report on the new Sentinel Innovation Center and what we're planning for the next 5 years. Next slide. The mission that we have together established and working closely with the Operations Center and the Communications Center is to improve human health by expanding Sentinel's active risk identification analysis capabilities. This is this ARIA system that was established and works so well with the Operations Center to effectively use electronic health record data for drug safety surveillance, and also increase our confidence in and use of real-world data for regulatory decision-making. So one is really two aspects. One is the drug safety surveillance through the ARIA system, expanding that, but also methods research in order to move real-world evidence forward for regulatory decision-making. Next slide, please. And that leads to our vision here for the next 5 years to establish a query-ready, quality-check distributed data network containing electronic health records with reusable analysis tools. Next slide, please. So in order to achieve that vision, the structure centers around 4 innovation cores. There's an executive leadership team supervising that, and the innovation cores are a core that is worried about data infrastructure and is moving that forward, about feature engineering, about causal inference, and about detection analytics, and I'm going to talk about that more in a second. We have innovation partners. Those are organizations that have specific technologies that are of great interest to us. That organization have data assets that are of great value to us in order to pilot test the methodological innovations that we are pushing through the innovation course. And then we have a national network of innovation experts that are contributing with their ideas, with projects that we are outsourcing to them, with them. The purpose of this network is to have as broad a reach as possible so that every innovation idea that is out there in the United States will be funneled through this into the innovation course so that we can take full advantage of this very broad network. Next slide, please. The executive leadership team is split between the Brigham and Women's Hospital with myself and Josh Gagne, and then we have Duke Clinical Research Institute of Duke University, where we have Leslie Curtis and Keith Bossolo. And what you see throughout this leadership team, it's a mix of those who have been with Sentinel for quite a while, some from the beginning of Sentinel, and there are some faces who are quite new to Sentinel, which is enriching the flow of ideas. We have Jennifer Nelson here from Kaiser Permanente Washington, and Patrick Haggerty from University of Washington, Kevin Johnson and Michael Matheny from Vanderbilt University. It's a fantastic team across multiple institutions with quite varied backgrounds, but still all have some sort of experience or link to Sentinel or other large national databases. Next slide, please. The collaborating organizations, much like what Rich showed, is a rich panel of experienced institutions and collaborators within those institutions that help with methods development, but also serve as providing data assets, data insights in order to pilot test new approaches. Next slide. The framework of the master plan, which is really the first task that we had to complete here, is that we start out with our strategic priorities, establishing a data infrastructure, expanding the feature engineering. How do we extract information out of the electronic health record data that can then feed into causal inference models, enhance causal inference, and then of course advancing detection analytics that build on all that. That will translate into specific goals, which will then translate into 21 specific initiatives that are orchestrated in order to achieve, in the end, the vision. And they're built on each other. We have 11 initial projects, and we have 10 future projects, but it's still a dynamic process, and we are building on that. And the outputs of each project are such that they build on each other, so that at the end, we will achieve this building of this query-ready, quality-checked distributed data network based on electronic health record information. Next slide, please. The priorities and topic areas, when we break this down, the data infrastructure is about, what are the right data sources, what is fit for purpose, what is the governance, harmonization, data quality assurances. That is very much what we learned already from the operations center, now transport a little bit more over to electronic health record data. Feature engineering, how to extract information from these unstructured and structured data, natural language processing, automated feature extraction, the computable phenotypes. How can we use this information to faster identify endpoints of interest and faster validate endpoints of interest? Causal inference, there are new methods evolving all the time. Targeted learning, we want to develop semi-automated analytic approaches, semi-automatic confounding adjustment, and calibration approaches in order to develop confidence in our causal inference. With regard to detection analytics, we have made already through the Operations Center quite some progress over the last 15 years, where we want to expand the methodological framework and statistical methods, and also move more into outcomes that were difficult to capture in earlier years, kind of cancer outcomes, and Rich already mentioned pregnancy and birth outcomes. Next slide, please. Here are two examples of projects that are already ongoing. A Horizon Scan project for electronic health record data sources, particularly if they're linked to claims data for a complete record of healthcare encounters. That is already ongoing. We have a project ongoing on improving causal inference and testing various approaches that are semi-automated algorithmic approaches that promise to minimize confounding, residual confounding even further. These are just two examples. There's a bunch of projects getting kicked off as we speak or in the next few weeks, and a whole bunch of projects that are slated for later times because they're building on what we find in these projects. Next slide. So thank you very much for allowing me to present the Sentinel Innovation Center and hand back.
All right, thanks very much, Sebastian. Lots of activity there too in the Innovation Center. And next, I'd like to turn to Asif. Thanks for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Mark, and hi, everyone. Thank you for being here today. As Mark mentioned, I'm the principal investigator leading the Community Building and Outreach Center, or CBOC for short. The CBOC is focused on increasing overall engagement with the Sentinel system, both in terms of the number of stakeholders using the Sentinel infrastructure and in terms of the number of use cases they use Sentinel for. We aim to make Sentinel a national and global analytics resource with an active community. Some of our goals are to harness the power of the Sentinel community and to deepen our partnerships with key stakeholder groups, ultimately leading to increased regulatory utility of the Sentinel system. Let's go to the next slide. The CBOC is determining new ways to engage and grow the Sentinel community. To guide us in this process, we are also developing our master plan. The master plan will outline a series of projects that the CBOC can implement to achieve FDA strategic priorities. We are building a Sentinel community that includes stakeholders from different groups, such as industry, the informatics community, patient advocacy groups, and other U.S. health agencies outside the FDA, as you can see here on the slide. We began developing the master plan by conducting discussions with a number of stakeholders connected to Sentinel or who may work with Sentinel in the future, including some of you on the line today. We specifically focused on three stakeholder groups: informaticians, epidemiologists, and patient advocates. These groups were chosen based on their unique perspectives and the opportunities that exist to increase their involvement with Sentinel. These conversations provided valuable insight into the ways that stakeholders outside the FDA would like to use the Sentinel infrastructure. Through these conversations, we gained a deeper understanding of how stakeholders envision themselves engaging with Sentinel. Many stakeholders expressed excitement at the potential of Sentinel and wanted to learn more about Sentinel or get involved with the community. We're working with FDA to realize their future vision for Sentinel set forth in the Sentinel System 5-year strategy, and developing a list of projects that could be used to address gaps between current state of Sentinel and future vision for Sentinel as it relates to this broad community. For example, the CBOC is planning to kick off a public-facing newsletter and to develop materials describing Sentinel's current capabilities and to help investigators better access the software tools available online. We're working with FDA to define a roadmap for implementing projects that would best serve the Sentinel community. This will guide CBOC's work over the next 5 years. Let's go to the last slide. Even while building out our plan, we've been able to bring some exciting changes to the Sentinel Initiative, including the redesigned website. The redesigned website launched in July with the second enhancement released last Tuesday. The new website is designed to address key pain points expressed by users of the previous website while modernizing the overall design of the site and making it more user-friendly. For example, we overhauled the navigation menu, grouping pages more intuitively. We implemented a new standardized search, table search, sort, and filter. Each table can also be exported into spreadsheets to enable analysis, and every major graphic can be downloaded. We fully redesigned the homepage to highlight key information and simplify messaging. We've improved the overall content layout, created an easier way to navigate the website, and implemented a new standardized table search. With the support of the FDA, as well as the SOC and IC, CBOC redesigned or improved over 1,000 pages, and this is just the beginning. Over the next year, we will continue to expand the capabilities of the website, including an updated global search feature and creating a focal point for Sentinel training and tools so that it can serve as a hub for the Sentinel community. I'm looking forward to taking part in today's conversation and sharing what's more in store for the CBOC. Thanks, Mark.
Awesome. Thanks very much for that presentation, and also from the Innovation Center, the Operations Center. Great to see all these pieces working together. So we would like, we're gonna have a little bit of time for discussion. If you all do have questions, remember you can submit them using Slido. And because people are already doing that, already got some good ones in. One that I'd like to start with for each of you is this one. You all touched on some of the ways in which this public-private partnership is working with industry already, particularly around data partners and experts on data analysis. But maybe you could add a little bit more to that. I'm not sure who wants to start. Rich, maybe?
Sure. So the simplest way is to contact us. Info at sentinel.org would be sentinelinitiative.org. So the website has an address, and if you write to us, we'll respond to you.
So you can participate directly, and you mentioned, Rich, the IMEDS program, which is actually extending out the Sentinel infrastructure for more direct collaborative use on industry-supported studies.
Absolutely. We've probably the first thing we would tell you when you connect with us is about the IMEDS program, and the fact that we've successfully conducted a substantial number of studies sponsored by industry through the IMEDS program. It's been highly successful.
Great. Sebastian, thoughts?
Yeah. Likewise, we love to engage with anybody who has any ideas, and bringing specific use cases forward. What are the challenges that people in industry are struggling with that we can work on together to build better methods in order to overcome these challenges? We are very, very open. Give us a call, send us an email. We're happy to engage. We already have partners from different industries involved, and I think that works very well for us.
Mm-hmm. And Bob, thoughts or?
Yeah, so I think, of course, FDA works directly with industry on particular issues, safety issues, through the regulatory process. But I would also emphasize the IMEDS program. And then more broadly, with respect to the CBOC, this is one of the areas where we're currently thinking about what is the best way to improve our approach to work with various stakeholders, including industry.
And Asif, you have on that last point especially, it sounds like you're doing some outreach already in the early days, but maybe more to come.
Yeah, definitely. Certainly more to come as well. And I share all the comments of my colleagues, because the more we learn about the intended uses or desired uses of Sentinel, challenges and opportunities, the more we can make sure that the community tools and forums and the way we're engaging can be usable and useful to the broad community. So keep sharing comments. We need them. It's very helpful, particularly at this early stage.
Okay, great. And see, we have another top question in. This one's for Rich, but Rich, I'm actually going to broaden this out a little bit because of your unique perspective on this whole program. I remember talking with you about it before this was even a legislative concept. You've been with this program from the beginning. You talked in your remarks about how far it's come and about some of the directions coming forward. Could you say a little bit more about what's coming? Sounds like a piece of that may be more data connections that could support maternal infant analyses, but other types of data coming in too. You all have emphasized electronic records. What about other types of data as well, other patient-generated data and the like? Maybe you could talk a little bit more about some of the things you see as best opportunities ahead.
Well, Game Ready is the mother-infant linkage data set we have now. We have linked data for 5.1 million pregnancies, which means that we are able now, and this really became fully operational during this last year. We are now able to link maternal exposures to birth outcomes. I think that will be transformative, because it'll no longer be, it should substantially reduce the need to try to develop product-specific registries of women exposed during pregnancy to monitor their outcomes. I mean, as long as I've been involved in this field, that's been a real challenge to understand safety during pregnancy, and we think this should be transformative. We're also trying pretty hard to make it simpler to link to the National Death Index, so that we can identify out-of-hospital deaths, which is one of the real challenges of doing certain kinds of work. And then we have very high hopes for the My Studies app, the ability to do highly protected collection of data and linkage to the individual's own data in the Sentinel Common Data Model gives us, I think, the ability to study a variety of kinds of information that are just not available, not only not available in claims data, but not available in electronic health records either, so that we can know things like the frequency of seizures that never come to medical attention, or hypoglycemic events, or symptoms of heart failure. And so I think we're well positioned to do things that I'd say, Mark, you and I didn't really anticipate getting to. At least I didn't anticipate getting to in my career.
Yeah, really impressive, and say linkages that should be very helpful as we continue to work through the COVID pandemic, with more treatments and vaccines becoming available too. Those linkages sound really helpful. Sebastian, maybe you talked a lot about how you're implementing the strategic plan around better methods, but the thing about methods is they do seem to be evolving rapidly as well. And you, in fact, you talked in your remarks about how what you're doing now is informing and suggesting some further directions. Where do you see the methods development headed around causal inference, and maybe around some of the issues that FDA has highlighted more generally in its real world evidence strategic directions around methods, as well as data that are fit for purpose?
Absolutely. So we see methods not in a data-free space, hypothesis-free space. We try to link the methods development to the reality of the data, mostly electronic health records combined with claims data, but then also the specific use cases where you have outcomes that are only observed in hospitals with and usually only recorded in the free text notes. There are subtle endpoints that we don't capture in well-coded data. What are the adaptations of existing methods for causal inference that we need to make in order to come to these conclusions about, the causal safety effects of medications. And while it's important, really important, to broaden our data universe, we should not pretend that we figured out electronic health records. There's lots of promise in electronic health records. There are still many, many challenges, how we overcome missing information, how we overcome the fact that certain information is recorded in light of the presentation of the patient, right? Tests are ordered in light of the prognostic assessment in patients. And that is all driving and complicating causal inference. And it is great fun to work in that field, and very impactful as we are making these data more useful for meaningful decision-making for the FDA.
It is really impressive, both important for meaningful decision-making, but also, as I think several people pointed out, some of the best distributed data networks out there anywhere for developing these cutting edge methods. So Sebastian, thank you. The whole panel, really appreciate you all covering so much ground in a concise way, and looking forward to next steps on the Sentinel program at CEDAR. Now we're going to transition straight into our second session on building the best network and establishing new capabilities for the surveillance of biologics. So we're switching over to the Biologics Center focus. This BEST network is focusing on a range of new initiatives as well. And our two panelists are going to highlight some key achievements of BEST over the last year in enhancing its capabilities for executing safety and effectiveness surveillance and informing regulatory decision-making. And they will also discuss ongoing work to support the expansion of the BEST network, the data network, and the methods infrastructure, to as well as specific studies using this evolving infrastructure as well. So very pleased to be joined by Hewley Wong, who is Associate Director for Innovation and Development at the Office of Biostatistics and Epidemiology in the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research at FDA, and Rich Forshee. Rich leads the Analytics and Benefit Risk Assessment team and the High Performance Integrated Virtual Environment team for the Office of Biostatistics and Epidemiology, also at CBER. So first we're going to hear from Hewley, so I'll turn to you now.
Thank you. On behalf of Dr. Azadeh Shoaibi, who's unable to join us today, I would like to present updates on the BEST initiative. Next, please. To fulfill CBER's mission on ensuring the safety and effectiveness of biologics, CBER's surveillance program has created and utilized a national post-market surveillance system for products, biologics regulated by CBER. In my presentation today, I'll touch on some of our findings and ongoing work for vaccines, blood components, and blood-derived products. Next, please. CBER surveillance program priorities include pandemic preparedness. In the next session, session 3, I'll share with you some of activities in that. Emerging infectious diseases, capacity to evaluate new products. This includes near real-time surveillance for vaccines, safety of vaccines in pregnancy, and infrastructure for hemovigilance. Next, please. So to meet that priorities, CBER surveillance program has built a collaborative of various diverse group of data partners seen here. This includes our federal partners, Veterans Administration, and also the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid, which in this panel will discuss the infrastructure of CMS. Next, please. For my talk, I'll focus on the BEST initiative. Next, please. And discuss on the expansion of BEST initiative since we all last met last spring, and provide some key highlights from some of the activities since last year. Next, please. So in terms of expansion, next, please. For claims database, next, please. We have added Optum, HealthCore, HealthVision, and One Florida. Next, please. Since 2017, CBER has added on quite a bit of electronic health records to address the specific needs of biologics. This includes ascertainment of biologics exposure, among other things. This is a diverse group of EHRs. This includes those directly sourced from healthcare systems and also aggregated EHR data sources used for various fit for purposes for our biologic surveillance. Next, please. This year, we added U of California, San Francisco, some PCORI partners, PeaceNet, One Florida, and Optum. Some of these, as you can see here, are linked EHR claims. We have found that in our last year to be helpful for resource-efficient use of study validation of outcomes, and also for bias analysis. Next, please. In line with our new data sources, we are excited then to partner with Observational Health Data Sciences and Informatics, or Odyssey, to convene for us Community Engagement and Development Initiative. Odyssey will help us to convene meetings and workshops, to conduct methods development activities, also to conduct outreach for our activities. This includes fellowships with academic centers to meet our needs, specific needs for biologics. One of the things, for example, that we are looking forward to take advantage of Odyssey's current activity now on developing more than 200 computer phenotypes that they'll present next week at the Odyssey panel. Next, please. With that, I'd like to highlight some key activities that we have done. The first one, next, please, is development of ICD-10 code algorithms. This is for our claims databases seen here. This is based on input from our pre-market and post-market colleagues. Next, please. I'm going to highlight specifically what we're doing in terms of building the infrastructure to monitor the safety and effectiveness of biologics taken during pregnancy. We also have mother-baby linkage. Next, please. And what we've done actually is to validate these ICD-10 algorithms for both pregnancy outcomes and gestational age using a linked claims age database. What the linked claims age database within our system here allows us to do is that the linkage with HR here, instead of paper records, has increased our efficiency of this validation studies, decreased the study period, and allowed us to actually look at more reviews. So in this case, within childbearing age, women of childbearing age, in this market scan Explorers Claims HR, next please. We looked at gestational age, seen here. This is helpful for us to actually determine the timing of biologics in our surveillance studies. Results, as you can see here, is that you tend to find that ICD-10 identified gestational age tends to underestimate gestational age. Next, please. We also validated pregnancy outcomes listed here: full-term live birth, preterm live birth, stillbirth, and spontaneous abortion. Next, please. With these validated outcomes, what we are able to then conduct this study, which is vaccine exposure during pregnancy. And these are vaccines that are recommended during pregnancy or contraindicated or not recommended during pregnancy. This is in Market Scan and Blue Health Intelligence, which is these are two large privately insured population, and also publicly insured population, and that is Medicaid. Next, please. We found that less than half of women in our databases actually received the vaccines recommended during pregnancy. Not shown here, those vaccines that are not recommended or are contraindicated, exposure to those are quite rare. Next, please. The next biologic that we'd like to share with you are blood components, and this includes red blood cell and plasma. Next, please. Now, last year we mentioned to you that building ISBT codes that's found in blood banks within EHRs in the BEST initiative allows us to actually capture a greater proportion of transfusions and actually at more granular level compared to the use of administrative claims database, codes within the administrative claims database. Next, please. So specifically, this expansion of the BEST initiative here for using ISBT codes from the blood banks in EHR allows a simultaneous ascertainment of transfused patients at episodes level, number of units, total number of units, and also processing and collection method. Next, please. We use that then to go on to conduct trends and patterns of blood component utilization in 3 hospital networks where EHRs are linked to blood bank data. This is with our colleagues with Regenstrief, Columbia University, and University of Colorado. Next, please. So we looked at trends at unit level, episode level, and patients level. Next, please. Our next biologic is blood-derived products. Next, please. Of which this is immunoglobulin. To address a need from our pre-market colleagues, we assess to assess the immunoglobulin shortages. We are describing trends in utilization of intravenous and subcutaneous immunoglobulin in both in large national claims database above 65 and under 65. This is at the level of administration, treatment episodes, patients, and dosage. And of note here, we are stratifying and looking in terms of product brand. Next, please. So for more details on the studies presented here and also our other studies, please visit our website, the BEST initiative, the website. Next, please. And thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much, Huli, for covering so much ground. A lot of work going on with BEST, and now I'd like to turn to our second presenter in this session. Rich, please go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for the opportunity to share some of the work that we're doing. Next slide, please. This presentation is really going to be a 2-part presentation. I'm going to talk about some of the innovative work that we're doing to try to use the data that are available to us to really solve some of the regulatory issues that we face. And I'm going to do this by talking about the work that we've done with one of our federal partners, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, And then I'm going to give another example from BEST of some of the innovative methods that have been developed to assist with adverse event reporting. Next slide, please. I'm going to start by talking about two aspects of how CMS helps us to address regulatory questions. The first is the way that it helps us with near-time monitoring. And then I'm going to give a little bit of a preview of the next session by talking about some of the ways that we've used CMS in monitoring for the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide, please. CMS is a great resource for the FDA. One reason that it's so important is that it covers the vast majority of Americans who are more than 65 years old. So it gives us terrific coverage of a very important age group that we want to be able to monitor for the safety and effectiveness of the products that we're responsible for. With regard to the study itself, to the CMS, it also is a very rapidly updated system. As you can see from the slide, we get information very quickly about hospitalizations. Typically, hospitalizations are identified, about 40% are identified within 10 days of admission, and 80% are identified within 25 days. We get daily updates of data that support near real-time tracking of cases. The contractor Acumen that works with CMS and FDA has also developed a robust infrastructure for rapid processing and analysis. And typically the new data are processed and synthesized in less than 24 hours. We've also worked with Acumen to develop some dynamic graphical tools to easily identify temporal and spatial trends. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to talk about some of the ongoing monitoring for the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide. Some of the ongoing surveillance that we're conducting with Acumen include the tracking of COVID-19 related outcomes and tests. One of the first things that I want to mention is that early on, and this was actually back in January and February, we began working with the ICD-10 codes to make sure that we had available a diagnosis code for COVID-19. Now that had already been in the works for October, but many of us advocated for moving that earlier, and it actually became available on April 1 and has proved to be very useful during these early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic. Using some of those codes, FDA working with Acumen and CMS have provided some real-time monitoring tools that provide counts and trends as of the prior day. So if we were looking at some of the tools today on October 14th, we would have information from October 13th available in these tools. This also has very granular information on geographic location. The counts are provided at county, state, and national level. And there's, indeed, we're planning to move all the way to individual hospital level counts. We can stratify these a number of ways. We can also adjust the process counts to account for historical claims delay patterns. And we can benchmark the counts against counts of the same event in the past to provide context. And again, these can be updated currently on a weekly basis, but daily updates are possible as well. Next slide, please. Now, these data help us to address important questions that affect regulatory decisions and planning for addressing COVID-19. The information directly helps us monitor current temporal and geographic trends in COVID-19. And it can also be used to help assess risk in vaccine effectiveness studies. And the reason that this is important for vaccine effectiveness studies is you need a good understanding of what the circulation of a disease is in order to understand the effectiveness of the vaccine. And finally, developing these tools has built valuable data infrastructure for all of the future COVID-19 projects that we'll be conducting. Next slide, please. These tools have also been used to develop an interactive Explorer tool. This data contains maps using GIS to monitor these trends geographically. We can create charts, and the data can be directly downloaded, and these are dynamically adjusted based on the user's selection criteria of the outcome, population, care setting, and metric. And these are available in an easy to use user interface. So even people who aren't familiar with programming will have the ability to explore the latest data from CMS on COVID-19. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to pivot a little bit to talk about one of the innovative methods that we've developed in BEST, and this is going to focus on how we can use advanced tools to support the reporting of adverse events. Next slide, please. So the aim of the project that I'm going to be describing is to leverage innovative methods for automated reporting of biologic product adverse events. And this is really a vision that our office director, Steve Anderson, laid out a few years ago to try to more efficiently capture adverse events in a way that is less burdensome on the reporters. And the specific accomplishment that I'm going to be discussing today is going to be the operational prototype enabling the semi-automatic delivery of adverse event case reports from EHRs to the FDA's FDA adverse event reporting system and the vaccine adverse event reporting system. Next slide, please. So the data for this project comes from electronic health record data systems that contain more than 12.5 million patients. And the data are brought into the system in an interoperable format. It uses the FHIR interoperable format, which is the Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources. And it uses the OMOP, Observational Medical Outcomes Partnership, common data model with automated data quality checks. And this is just a screenshot of some of the examples of the kinds of data quality checks that are done automatically as part of the system's operation. Next slide, please. The next stage of the process is to actually detect the adverse events. And the goal here is to reduce the need, we'll never eliminate the need for human intervention on this, but to reduce the need by developing automated detection algorithms. And we've begun with a project to look for 6 vaccine and blood adverse events. And these algorithms are portable and utilize clinical notes that are derived from natural language processing. So the idea here is to reduce the amount of time that humans need to spend on reviewing the reports and get more capture of the adverse events. And the algorithms are designed to be scalable so it can be expanded into other systems. Next slide, please. The next step in the process is to validate the reports that are found through the detection system. And so this is to provide a semi-automated tool for efficient chart review. So the tool is going to scan through all of the information that's included in the electronic health record system, organize it, and highlight some of the key features. Some of the things we've highlighted on this example slide are information that helps a reviewer determine the certainty of exposure, information to help understand the severity of the reaction, the certainty of the outcome, and recommended evidence for the reviewer to look at. We've also worked on validating these algorithms, and the positive predictive values so far have been ranging from 92 to 100% for these programs. Next slide, please. And then the next step in the demonstration project was to show that we could actually take the information that had been extracted from the electronic health records and report it back into the existing systems, the FAERS and the VAERS systems. And so we've been doing a pilot study to take all of this information, reformat it in a way that's consistent with the needs of FAERS and VAERS. And we've submitted 50 case reports to FAERS and VAERS to demonstrate the feasibility of this system. And our plan is to work on scaling this up in future years of the project. Next slide, please. Obviously, this was not all my work. I want to thank the many people in CBER. IBM has done a lot of work on the EHR adverse event reporting system that I just discussed. And there's been a great deal of work over many years and a strong collaboration between FDA, CMS, and Acumen. Next slide, please. I just wanted to leave you by showing some of the people of CBER. This photo was taken from one of our gingerbread house contests, some of which were quite creative, and you can see the large number of people who are working to help keep biologics products safe and effective. With that, I'll thank you very much for your time and attention, and turn it back to our organizers. Thank you.
Hey, Rich, thanks for the presentation, covering a lot of ground, and clearly a pre-COVID picture there, but glad
That's
to see
right.
so many people working so hard on these really timely issues. And I guess a little bit more seriously for both of you, and maybe starting with Hugh Lee. Could you say a little bit more about some of the applications you're seeing for these new capabilities that you're building? I think Hugh Lee, you particularly talked about some of the opportunities around or some of these data extensions and analyses. What do you see as some of the important near-term regulatory applications?
Some of these will be used for COVID-19 vaccine surveillance, for example, and for HR systems. We have pivoted to HR mainly to meet a number of biologic needs. Coincidentally, actually, the COVID-19 pandemic, then some of these actually require some of the data elements in EHRs. So these are the ones I think we'll be using in near future, or are using right now. I'm going to check and see whether Rich or Steve have anything to add to that.
Well, I'll just add that obviously almost all of our attention right now is focused on issues related to the COVID-19 pandemic. This is an unprecedented public health emergency that we're all facing. And so we've been redirecting our resources to try and address these questions. One of the key things that we're trying to do right now is to build up our capabilities so that we're ready to monitor for the safety and effectiveness of any COVID-19 vaccines that may be approved and start being used. And a lot of the programs that we've talked about in our discussion today are really allowing us to do essentially a shakedown cruise to find out what works, where there are problems, and how we can improve. So I think that's the most immediate use of some problems and how we can improve. So I think that's
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. And we're going to be talking a good deal more about COVID-19 applications with Steve and others in the next session. Maybe Rich, just one more question for you about extending the work that you've already described. So the CMS data linkages sound very interesting and impressively timely, I would add as well. You talked about some of the COVID applications there, about understanding cases in a community, and potentially about if the data could be linked to vaccine information for effectiveness of vaccines and side effects. Are you all thinking yet about applications to other products, other vaccines and the like beyond COVID for those CMS data linkages? And I think you're on mute, Rich.
Yeah, sorry, I was having okay, I'm fixed it. So a couple of things with regard to that that question. We've actually used CMS pretty extensively for looking at the safety and effectiveness of vaccines in the past. We have done work on zoster vaccines, and we've also done quite a bit of work on influenza vaccines that are administered to people who are 65 years and older. And so those capabilities have allowed us to answer some questions that really complement some of the RCTs that have been conducted. We've been able to look at questions such as duration of effectiveness of vaccines. We've been able to look at more severe outcomes such as hospitalizations and deaths following influenza that would be extraordinarily difficult to examine in RCTs. So with regard to the CMS capabilities that we've had, those have allowed us to do a lot of work on the effectiveness side. We've also used those resources to do safety monitoring for influenza vaccines, particularly for Guillain-Barré syndrome. And we expect a lot of those capabilities that we developed we're going to be able to apply to monitoring safety and effectiveness of COVID-19 vaccines.
Great, thanks. And see one of the top questions up from David. You talked some about the semi-automated capturing of adverse events from a growing range of electronic medical record systems. Can you maybe expand on that a little bit? What you mean by particularly the manual part? I get the extraction capabilities and how that's evolving, and then this question about duplicate events.
Sure, I can address that. So the status quo ante had been that everything had to focus on the manual recording of adverse events, and there were a couple of concerns with that. One concern was that we could be missing a lot of adverse events because they just didn't get reported. And the second was that it could be burdensome on people providing these reports. Healthcare professionals are incredibly busy and have important needs to care for the patients they're responsible for. And so things that can be done to reduce that burden, we think would be quite valuable. So the systems that we're building are ones that will provide a first pass. We're trying to make it as high quality as we possibly can. You saw that we're getting positive predictive values above 90% in the systems that we're using. And they also automate the reporting process, so they remove that burden as well. So the goal is to have computers do as much as computers are good at doing. Now, there's no way to take human judgment out of the equation when we're evaluating what all of these data mean, but that's the goal, is to try to have computers provide as much support for the people who are responsible for both making the reports and evaluating them. Now, the second part of the question had to do with duplicate capturing of events. This is a problem with manual voluntary reporting, as well as with the automated reporting that we're doing. We've had several projects over the last few years that try to do deduplication using probabilistic methods, comparing as many features of the reports as possible to get an idea of the ones that are very likely to be the same report, and then that can ultimately be adjudicated by human reviewers. But having automated reports to look at the similarity between different reports that come in can reduce the number of duplicates and help people focus on the most likely duplicates that are included. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, very helpful. And just one quick follow-up. You talked about some pretty impressive positive predictive value statistics and the work you've done so far. Any comments on the negative predictive value, a sense of what you may be missing that's important?
So it's much harder to determine what we're missing, and unfortunately, I don't have those negative predictive values in front of me. I think some other members of the team may be part of this, and if one of those has an answer, perhaps they could mention in chat, and at some later time, we might be able to see if some other members of the team can answer that.
Yeah, well, I'm confident as you keep building out these data sources that you'll get a better handle on that too. Really want to thank both of you for the discussion during this session about all the activities taking place in BEST, many of which, as Rich highlighted, are related to COVID-19 activities. We are going to turn to focus on COVID-19 and the Sentinel Initiative next. All right, I'd like to welcome everyone back to our third session on leveraging the Sentinel Initiative for COVID-19. As you heard from Rich and others early in the last session and previously, COVID-19 is obviously a huge area of focus at FDA right now, along with its many other responsibilities. And here we're going to spend a bit more time going in depth in how the Sentinel Initiative and related activities are having a significant impact on the COVID response. So we'll hear about some of the key ongoing efforts across CDER and CBER to leverage this data and analytic infrastructure that keeps expanding. And we'll hopefully have a chance to talk about some of the learnings and implications of the COVID-19 response for future Sentinel-related activities as well. There's a diverse range of projects underway that cover the course of illness, that cover real-world issues related to the safety and the effectiveness of emerging COVID-19 therapeutics and vaccines, including some prep for the products that may be available in the coming weeks and months. So lots of perspectives to discuss this. Our panelists include Gerald Dalpon, who is the Director of the Office of Surveillance and Epidemiology at CDER at FDA, Jeff Brown, who's Associate Professor in the Department of Population Medicine at Harvard Medical School and the Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare Institute. He is the lead data scientist for the FDA Sentinel system. Vincent Loray is Associate Professor of Medicine in the University of Pennsylvania's Division of Infectious Disease and Senior Scholar at the Penn Center for Clinical Epidemiology and Biostatistics, and Senior Investigator in the Penn Center for Pharmacoepidemiology Research and Training. Glad also to welcome Steve Anderson, who's Director of the Office of Biostatistics and Epidemiology in the Biologics Center at FDA. And then back with us again for this session, Hewley Wong, who, as you know, is Associate Director for Innovation and Development at the Office of Biostatistics at CBER. Gerald, we're going to start with some remarks from you.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks to the organizers for having me at this year's Sentinel Annual Public Meeting. So I'm just going to give a few remarks, and then you'll hear from Jeff Brown and Vin Loray as to what they're doing with the Sentinel system in terms of drugs. Then you'll hear from our CBER colleagues. So this pandemic has really underscored the importance of having a standing and ready analytic platform with real-world data, such as we have in Sentinel, that can be activated for public health emergencies. And rapid response is built into the Sentinel system. The data in Sentinel are routinely refreshed, they're quality checked, and they're query ready. And most of the tools we use are pre-written and validated to suit a variety of needs. And the system, I think as everyone knows, as Rich showed on his slide, is backed by a vast network of academic and private sector expertise that allows FDA to quickly mobilize a wide array of scientific disciplines to collaborate on studies that are important to us. But our readiness comes not only from Sentinel's structure, but also from the 10 years or so experience we've had to date. We've been primed by prior exposure to multiple public health situations, such as the 2009 H1N1 pandemic, Zika virus, the opioid epidemic, and then the questions that arise in our day-to-day work on the wider range of products we regulate, signals that come from clinical trials, signals that come from other studies. And each of these prior experiences has incrementally tested the system with different challenges. Sometimes we need the freshest data to answer a question. Sometimes we need real rapid analytic speed, getting a query result back in a matter of days after we complete the specifications. And throughout this decade, the past decade, we've worked closely with the Sentinel Operations Center at Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare Research Institute to address these challenges as they've come up, and to build Sentinel and grow it stronger to meet these needs. And this long-standing public-private partnership has really helped us. And it's important that part of what we've done in building Sentinel is a wide array of preparedness efforts, even when we haven't needed them, because it was never an issue of would we need them, the issue was when we would need them. And so we've continued to enhance our emergency preparedness capabilities. For example, since the last pandemic, we've launched several projects aimed at improving our readiness to monitor medical countermeasures, including a mobile app that can be used to collect patient-generated data and link this information to electronic health records. Our FDA Office of Counterterrorism and Emerging Threats has also initiated a project a few years ago to develop new data sources and methods to capture ordinal endpoints, that is, health outcomes along a multi-point severity scale. And a lot of that work has been able to inform our response to COVID-19. So when it came to activating Sentinel for COVID-19, our prior investments paid off and we were ready. As you'll hear from Jeff Brown and Vin Leray, we've launched a variety of products in Sentinel as part of projects rather than Sentinel, as part of our agency's public health response. We've been monitoring drug utilization, hospitalizations of coronavirus infections, validation of claims-based algorithms of COVID infections, and a variety of other rapid queries in Trinetics. And you'll hear about these from Jeff and from Vin. I'm going to end by saying that this isn't only a national response, but it's a global response as well to try to understand treatments for COVID. And toward this end, we've engaged in international collaborations, including with ICMRA. ICMRA is the International Coalition for Medicines Regulatory Authorities, as well as with the European Medicines Agency, EMA, to use real-world data to research the impact of COVID-19 in pregnant women and their infants. And so through those collaborations, we're sharing knowledge, study protocols, analytic parameters, and outcome algorithms. So Sentinel's been a very important part of both the US and the global COVID response. And we very much appreciate the collaboration we've had with the data partners, the investigators, and all the other collaborators. So I'm going to stop here, and I think we turn over back to you, Mark, or to Jeff.
That's right, and then go straight to Jeff. Gerald, thanks very much for that overview. Jeff, I'll turn to you, and I think you've got some slides to present.
Just unmuting. So thanks for that. So I'm going to spend some time really talking about the preparedness. What have we been thinking about as a lead data scientist for Sentinel? My job's to stress about the data and think about how to prepare so that when FDA calls, we're ready. So I'm going to talk about a few of the projects that we're doing there, not all of them. Gerald mentioned more and Rich mentioned some others. So next slide. So, you know, COVID's creating a unique set of challenges. Good news is I think we're ready to handle them, but there are a unique set of challenges when you're dealing in a pandemic with a new disease. Well, I know we talked about information urgency. We need real-time data. We need updated data pretty quickly, and we need the data to be fresh. That's different than the kind of normal operating procedure. We're working in a new condition. So there were no codes for COVID until April, and we don't know if people are using them and how well they're using them. We want to get infection status. Well, now I got to deal with labs, and now there's hundreds of labs, and we have to figure out, well, how do I find these labs and use them? And then, because it's so new, how did the changing coding practices change over time? I can't assume that what I saw last year or 3 years ago or 5 years ago will match the patterns of care that we see today in the pandemic. So you have to be really careful. Then you worry about exposures. Well, if we have therapies that are in the inpatient setting, how will those get coded and flow through the system? Will we have the level of granularity we need within the system to be able to do the work that we expect we'll have to do? So that's for both therapies. So whether it's inpatient therapies, maybe they'll be outpatient. We'll have the same issues with vaccines and how do you find vaccines. And Rich and Steve are, I'm sure, working hard on that as well. But we have to be able to find those exposures. I'm also a little bit worried about multiple products, whether they're therapies or vaccines, appearing on the market in short time. So if there's multiple products all approved within a really short window, what we'll see is lots of folks all making demands on the same small set of partners, whether they're data partners or scientific partners. So that's unusual in a pandemic. That's created because of this pandemic. So if we see that, it could create bottlenecks in how we work. So there, my plea is for coordination and collaboration. I think it's going to be really critical in this space, and that's really pretty unique to COVID. And this potential for multiple products to be approved all around the same time. Next slide. So I'm just going to talk about a couple of the projects that we're implementing in preparation. So one of them is a rapid distributed database. So we're asking some of our partners to do rapid refreshes with freshest feasible data. And Rich Borshi mentioned this is what they're doing with CMS data, and they've got really excellent access to that CMS data. We're doing the same kind of thing with our partners. We've updated the data model to include the COVID lab results. So we're doing freshest feasible, the data curation of those data as they're updated, and then that allows us to do rapid querying. So you have to do that preparation in order to be able to do this kind of rapid querying. Next slide. That's one of the projects. I'll just mention, because this is my job to worry. At any point in time when you're working with neo real-time data, there's a set of complexities that just as a community we should all be aware of. Good news is we know about them, but it's at any point in time the data are going to be incomplete when you're using neo real-time data, and at any point in time exposures are going to be more complete than outcomes. Good news is we know how to deal with that, so Sentinel has substantial experience and our data partners in dealing with data lags and uncertainty issues and methodological approaches to dealing with the complexity of using the freshest feasible neo real-time data. But it's important to note. Next slide. And just I wanted to touch on some of our new partnerships. So Gerald mentioned Trinetics, and we also were working with HCA and Redesigned to get at EHR data in a neo real-time way so we can really query the data, update it quickly. So we've been building interactive dashboards showing geographic and temporal patterns in inpatient drug use. So FDA really wanted good line of sight into the use of drugs in the inpatient setting. So we went out and partnered with our EHR partners to develop these dashboards and be able to query and update these data rapidly to give that good line of sight into the inpatient data. We're also using the EHR data for COVID-19 hospitalization rates, and we can update those and see how they're trending, COVID-19 patient characteristics, comorbidities, all this idea of rapid use. And I'll just note that the idea here is to match the data to the use. So the neo real-time EHR data, this is a great use for those data. And I think we're matching data to use really pretty well now, but we're going to continue to learn how to do that. Next slide. I just wanted to end with another preparatory piece of work. Very early on in COVID, we realized we're going to need an algorithm. And lots of people realize they're going to need you want a validated claims-based algorithm to be able to use for COVID-19 to be able to use in your largest data sources, which are commercial claims in this country. So we went and partnered with 5 of our data partners. We tested 5 different algorithms over 3 different windows of time, because we imagined that the coding patterns might change over time, to come up with the positive predictive value and sensitivity of the algorithms. You know, the good news is the simple algorithm, which is essentially one code, seemed to work pretty well. You have to do this prep work in order to give yourself the confidence that you can use those algorithms for the future work. So this is kind of this fundamental preparatory work that we did. You can see the positive predictive value was pretty good. We'll put that on our website, and then we'll kind of move on to the next problems that we face. But thanks for having me, Mark.
Jeff, thank you very
Mark,
much for
there you
those. Yeah, thanks very much for those comments and all the preparatory work. Very thoughtful. Next, we're going to hear from Vincent.
Hi. Can I have my slides up, please? So I'm Vin Lowray. I'm an infectious disease physician and pharmacoepidemiologist at the University of Pennsylvania. And I have been collaborating with Sentinel really on the focus of studying the natural history of COVID-19. And particularly, I'm going to talk a bit about our work focusing on the risk of arterial and venous thrombotic events in the Sentinel system. Next slide, please. So I think from my standpoint as both an infectious disease physician and pharmacoepidemiologist, I think there is really a great need in the field for real world evidence on COVID-19. I think if you're keeping up with the clinical literature, you'll recognize that there are numerous limitations of existing data. The bulk of the evidence is from case reports and case series. Many of them are limited in their sample sizes. They're from single centers. There's a number of inherent biases, issues of selection bias, issues of misclassification, and often lack of control of relevant confounding variables. And I think that the Sentinel system really offers a unique opportunity to generate real-world evidence on COVID-19, whether it be for the epidemiology and natural history of COVID-19, to study the effects of chronic medications that are taken in the ambulatory setting on the course of COVID-19 illness, or for the safety and effectiveness of COVID-19 therapies. Next slide, please. And I think really Sentinel was really ahead of the curve and recognizing the ability to leverage the existing data to be able to answer these questions that, in May, they had developed the work group, which I co-led with Catherine Yee, to develop a COVID-19 natural history master protocol, really with the aim of providing a set of approaches to identify COVID-19 patients within the data partners of the Sentinel system, to delineate the variables that were going to be relevant for such analyses. So the comorbidities, the outcome complications, medications, laboratory variables, radiographic variables, to determine the feasibility of the collection of these variables within Sentinel's electronic health record and claims-based data partners. And then for each of these variables, to formulate code lists. And we really spent a lot of time in the work group, the clinicians amongst us, both people like myself, people in the agency at Operations Center, to really come up with clinically relevant code lists, at least as initial runs for investigators to use down the road. And we spent a considerable amount of time going through the potential limitations of these methods and to provide approaches to address them, approaches to develop and overcome selection bias, address misclassification, protopathic bias, address unmeasured confounding, and address issues of generalizability and representatives. Next slide, please. And as we were completing sort of the work on that master protocol, we were beginning to see in the literature reports of abnormalities in blood coagulation, arterial and venous thrombotic events. We were reading about acute myocardial infarctions and strokes among COVID-19 infected individuals, even at younger ages. Reports of venous thromboembolism, both deep venous thrombosis, DVT, pulmonary embolism, PE, and reports of abnormalities in coagulation in D-dimer, fibrinogen, evidence of a consumptive coagulopathy leading to bleeding, disseminated intravascular coagulation, and concerns that these abnormalities in blood coagulation were really contributing to severe outcomes of COVID-19. So if you could just advance the slide, please. And so as a consequence of this, Sentinel assembled a multidisciplinary team of infectious disease physicians, hematologists, data scientists, clinical and pharmacoepidemiologists, biostatisticians, who were really tasked, and I have the privilege, along with Jeff, of co-leading this work group, formulating aims to address the abnormalities in coagulation and developing methods from the applied from the master protocol, but extending those methods to really address these key questions. And so, next slide, please. We had 3 specific aims. The first was a descriptive aim to determine the 90-day incidence of both arterial and venous thrombotic events, evaluated separately because they are potentially have separate pathogenesis with COVID-19, and the risk of death within 90 days of an event. Advance the slide, please. Our second aim was to evaluate the patient characteristics that were present prior to COVID-19 diagnosis as risk factors for both arterial and venous thrombotic events, again, evaluated separately. And here we really developed a conceptual framework and model that identified hypothesized risk factors based on the Virchow's triad of factors that can promote arterial and venous thrombotic events: endothelial injury, stasis of circulation, and hypercoagulability, to help us to understand the biology and identify the subgroups that are at highest risk for these events. And then the third aim, advance please, the bulk of the data, as I said, is case reports and case series. And so there really are no comparator groups to be able to compare rates of arterial and venous thrombotic events with COVID-19. And so we felt that influenza, another common respiratory virus with potentially severe outcomes, would be a relevant comparator group. And so in our third aim, proposed to compare the 90-day risk of arterial and venous thrombotic events between health plan members in the Sentinel system with COVID and those with influenza. Next slide, please. And just to give you some sense of this, what we thought were the significance of these aims from a biological standpoint, to gain insights into the risk factors for these thrombotic events and really determine if the risk of these events are higher for those with COVID-19 versus influenza. From a clinical standpoint, to identify really the high-risk subgroups in whom clinicians could, which could help clinicians inform their decision-making, potentially on initiation of pharmacological interventions, and that this would potentially be the high-risk subgroups in whom we would enroll in future trials, and to identify potential interventions, such as medications that might reduce the risk of thrombotic events with COVID-19. And then, of course, from a public health standpoint, modifying risk factors for these events could help to prevent their development and ultimately prolong survival. Next slide. So just to conclude with the work group's activities to date, at this point, we've spent a considerable time developing a formal study protocol and are currently establishing collaborations with multiple integrated delivery system and claims-based data partners within Sentinel. And the whole goal of trying to use multiple data partners is to increase the sample size and ensure that we have appropriate power to be able to identify the risk factors and to detect differences between COVID-19 and influenza patients, to enhance the generalizability and to permit evaluation of laboratory data to get at a better understanding of the biology of these coagulation abnormalities that occur over time. The multiple data partners also would allow for limited chart reviews to confirm the positive predictive values of the ICD-10 based arterial and venous thrombotic events. And then lastly, we've been working very, very closely with the Reagan-Udall Foundation, and particularly to engage with other stakeholders to enhance the scientific validity of our work and to promote parallel analyses across other groups, which I think will also further enhance the scientific validity. So next slide, just want to conclude by acknowledging my colleagues at Penn, at the Sentinel Operations Center, and at the agency, who've really put an extraordinary amount of effort in a very, very short period of time to push this forward. So thanks for your attention.
Vin, thanks very much for that thoughtful and very timely presentation. We'll look forward to hearing the further updates. Next, I'm going to turn to Steve Anderson from CBER.
Next slide. So I thought what I would do is talk about how we're using the infrastructure that we're building in BEST, in CMS with our partnership with CMS, and then also even the Sentinel Initiative partnerships overall, in sort of planning for monitoring for COVID-19 vaccine safety and effectiveness. Next slide. So I think we're all aware that there isn't currently a licensed or approved vaccine in the US. There are several COVID-19 vaccines in phase 3 trials that are currently underway. So the potential is that one of these may be available for use in the United States in a matter of weeks or months. I think the one thing that we're also facing with these vaccines is that many have, or some of them have, new platform technologies, maybe using new adjuvants that will need to be considered as we're thinking about how do we monitor these products for safety and effectiveness. So I think what FDA is committed to and generally does for vaccines is continuous monitoring in the post-market setting for both largely safety initially, and then later on effectiveness. We're doing this by thinking about this by passive surveillance, which is the VAERS system. And I won't talk much about that. I'm going to really focus on the second part. Next slide, which is really active surveillance approaches, which includes the systems we're talking about today, BEST, the FDA, CMS, and even the Sentinel system. So the next slide. I just wanted to give some perspective, though, about our thinking, how vaccines are different from therapeutics, and how we have to consider that in our monitoring plan. So vaccine benefit risk considerations really are different from therapeutics, which are used for life-saving purposes. So vaccines are given to healthy people, and the tolerance for vaccine risk, because they're given to healthy people, may be lower. So accordingly, our approach has been to think about getting high quality data and information to assess and confirm potential adverse events or safety concerns for these new vaccines coming up on the market potentially. Next slide. So other considerations and actually needs are sort of rapid data access for near real-time surveillance. So that gets to Jeff's point and others have made about the freshest data. So we really need freshest data. The other thing is that there's many vaccines of adverse events of interest are largely the rare serious adverse events. So we need, to consider using large databases of tens of millions of patients for evaluating these events. We also need data that represent sort of the spectrum of integrated care, meaning from the outpatient setting, physicians' offices, to inpatients that reflect where people get their vaccines to where they're going to show up if they get a serious adverse event and that'll probably be in an inpatient hospital setting. We need rapid confirmation of safety signals or concerns, and that gets to, significant clinical detail may be needed, or even use of medical chart confirmation tools. So we'll need the data fields. We'll need to think about using unstructured data as well as structured data fields to really do that verification in either EHR systems or in claims-based systems. The next slide. So I think some other things that we're thinking about is wherever possible to have case definitions for adverse events of interest. And so Brighton Collaboration and others are developing those for many of the ones that are of interest. Algorithms, phenotype development, and then validation of those phenotypes and algorithms will be really critical. And it's been spoken about before. I think Jeff spoke about it, and Bob and others. Really rapid sort of on-demand analytics and tools will be really critical here, so that you have sort of this flexibility to do the kinds of analyses that you need to really answer kind of the regulatory questions that will arise. And that also means doing things like master protocols for safety and effectiveness outcomes. So we're going to be doing those as well. Subject matter experts, you can't underestimate the need for these, because we not only need, vaccine experts, but we need the epidemiologists, we need, the bioinformatics support and others to really be thinking about how we can best do this type of monitoring in the future. Next slide. So I'm going to talk about our monitoring systems. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so for our best system, we've really talked about this, at least Lee and Rich Forshee have talked about this, so I'm not going to go too far into depth. So as you can see, we have several partners engaged, and then we have a mixture of claims, electronic health records, and then as mentioned by others, claims and EHR linked data to sort of draw upon for conducting these types of analyses that we're thinking about. Next slide. So I just wanted to sort of also mention the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. Rich Forshee went really in depth into this, so I'm not going to say too much, just to remember that the elderly are really a population of interest when thinking about COVID, but also when thinking about COVID vaccine. So the CMS data is powerful, represents the 55 million elderly beneficiaries that it covers, which is most of the US population, 92% or more. So that's not really a sample necessarily, it really is the entire population that's captured in this potential sets of data. It represents a variety of healthcare systems, so meets a lot of the criteria that we really think are important for conducting safety and then effectiveness type of analyses. And then the one thing is this claims data does have access to medical charts, so that's another critical factor in getting that access to that clinical details. So the next slide, please. This next slide really just shows sort of a working list that we have in-house on a variety of different possible adverse event outcomes or adverse outcomes for a potential COVID vaccine that we're thinking about. So you can see sort of on the left are some of the, at the top are some of the usual ones that we think about in general for vaccines. And then on the right is sort of some that are specific to, and lower to the right are some that are specific to COVID that might be potentiated. These types of symptoms might be potentiated by a vaccine. And then I just wanted to mention the one at the far right bottom, which is enhanced disease. So that's one of interest to us because a vaccine may have the potential, and some vaccines in the past have had this, where they might actually potentiate serious COVID disease. So we want to be monitoring for that as well to see if that's an issue. and then implementing appropriate measures to decrease those risks. So the next slide. So obviously, I think our interest is in doing, not obviously, but our interest is in doing near real-time surveillance or rapid cycle analyses. So our plan really is kind of considering 10 to 20 safety outcomes of interest that we would monitor on a day in and day out basis, probably getting hopefully up to sort of weekly digests of data that we can determine whether there's any increases in these specific adverse events. We'll draw from those lists that I sort of had in the previous slide. There are other lists too that of potential adverse events of interest. But also we need to look at that pre-market data, which is that phase 3 data, and for any signs or potential safety concerns there to sort of identify outcomes that we might evaluate. We're also identifying these outcomes in coordination with our federal partners. So we're working closely with CDC, CMS, obviously, VA, and then others. And I'll talk a bit more at the end about those partnerships and how important they are. And then get data from other sources, literature, regulatory experience with similar vaccines. So next slide. So, you know, in thinking about doing this, we do have experience and considerable experience in doing sort of near real-time surveillance. I'll mention that we did this with GBS, and we did this for influenza vaccines since 2007, so I have a good record with those. And then we've done sort of safety analyses and trying to adjudicate signals that come from rapid cycle analyses. And then I also wanted to mention in the Fda Sentinel system, we conducted a rapid surveillance project in the 2017 and 18 season, and then identify, or we're looking at 6 health outcomes of interest. So again, experience there, but I just wanted to touch on the next slide. So one thing to consider is we have these 10 to 20 outcomes, and if any of those are elevated in risk or signal for potential risk, then we want to have capabilities to resolve those potential safety signals in rapid time. And we also may be, you know, also getting signals from tree scan that others may be using, like CDC and VA, and then trying to adjudicate those as well. So it'll be important to have our systems available to do rapid queries, epidemiological studies, as well as sort of more comprehensive studies. So we're going to have to think about strategically, how do we deploy our data to be able to cover a potentially large number of outcomes. If we have 1 vaccine, it might be okay, but if we get to 3, 4, 5, then we need to think about carefully how to deploy these resources, and so that we have independent data sets available too for verification studies. So a lot to think about here. Next slide. What I wanted to also mention is that we're planning on doing effectiveness studies, either so manufacturers may conduct those in the middle of the slides, may conduct certain COVID-19 effectiveness post-licensure studies, but FDA may also do that. So we're considering how that might be done. Those might be general effectiveness studies, including subpopulations of interest, like the elderly, pregnant women, and so on and so forth. And then duration of protection, because these vaccines are new. We don't have any history to know how long they're going to be effective for. So we'll need better data on that too, and may rely on post-market data to get that information. Next slide. Okay, so I just wanted to mention that FDA isn't alone in this effort. So this is really, we're part of a large US government-wide effort. So CDC has responsibilities for vaccine safety and effectiveness. So we're working closely with them. I've mentioned CMS, the Veterans Administration, but other sister agencies at HHS and other departments that we're working with as well on ensuring, planning for these is as coordinated as possible. So weekly meetings between FDA, CDC, and then CMS and VA, we have regular meetings with too. Plan to share common protocols that we have, master protocols, and discuss outcomes of interest, excuse me. And then finally, I think at least one concept would be is that not only is FDA doing these rapid cycle analyses for these outcomes, but also CDC will be doing those in their vaccine safety data link. VA will be doing those in their systems, so that we do have a good representation of the population and then access to sort of granular data to identify and sort of verify those outcomes. And the next slide, I think that's it. I just wanted to thank and acknowledge all the I will say hundreds of people, it seems, that are really involved in these efforts. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Hey, Steve, thanks for that that comprehensive overview. Next, we're going to turn to Hui Li again for some further discussion of some of the CBER activities here. And you may be on mute, Hui Li.
I was muted.
Okay.
So I'd like to expand on what Steve has mentioned and touch on some of those and go a little bit more detail. Next slide, please. What I'll do is to share with you our preparedness programs that we have currently right now in BEST and in CMS, and then offer some of the current studies that we have for available biologics for COVID-19. Next slide, please. As I previously mentioned, pandemic preparedness is one of CBER's priority. Next slide. And I've also gave a summary of the AHR claims and linked claims AHRs. Of this, we have a diverse need for this, rare adverse events for vaccines, and also lots of data, clinical data in AHRs for effectiveness studies for biologics. Next slide. So to do that, we're preparing within our BEST and CMS infrastructure. This includes characterization of this COVID-19 patient cohorts, validating claims-based diagnosis codes, and then there's test positivity trends. This is the trends. This is RT-PCR data, and then lastly the risk factors of COVID-19 hospitalization and mortality in the elderly population. Next slide. And then I'll present a summary of what we're doing with one of the biologics for this treatment for COVID-19, convalescent plasma, and for vaccine. Next slide. So I'll start first with preparatory work. Next slide. To build upon our work in AHR since the inception of BEST initiative, we are now looking into COVID-19 cohorts. This includes characterizing hospitalized patients with COVID-19 in an academic health center that's directly sourced from there, that is based in the DC metro area, in another one, which is one Florida, and also in an aggregated data set. We found that depending on what type of information we need and what type of studies we're doing, that will depend on what type of AHR data sources we'll be using. So we are looking into demographics, baseline comorbidities, concomitant medications. Oxygenation status is a particularly one that's important, particularly if you're looking into effectiveness study in AHRs, because that with our clinicians, that for us is disease severity proxy. And each one of, and also the outcomes, so hospitalization outcomes. Each one of these actually would require an algorithm to pull out from each of these different AHRs. What we're doing is to actually look at the clinical management in each of the data sources, discuss with the clinicians and mathematicians and epidemiologists, statisticians there, and then look at data providence. From then on, then build up these study elements in here. Next slide, please. So we have heard actually validation of the ICD-10 code for claims, and this is for studies in claims, the U07.1. So we are validating that in linked claims AHRs, both the positive predictive value, and this is for studies, COVID-19 studies for therapeutic biologics, and for negative predictive value, which is important for vaccine effectiveness. Next slide. So that was identifying those who have COVID-19 in claims. In EHRs, BEST initiative is going to use the SARS-CoV-2 RT-PCR test. We have characterized this in terms of RT-PCR test, rapid test, and everything else. And based on what we see, we'll be using RT-PCR test. I'm going to show you some preliminary results and explain how that helps in our study design for COVID-19 work. in an academic health center that's within the DC metro system, and in Explorer's aggregated data set. Next slide. So around 250,000 patients that has RT-PCR results. Out of this, around 10 to 15% of those test positive. So it's among these patients that we look at demographics, age, race, ethnicity. And for example, in this case, around 1/3 of these has severe enough disease to be hospitalized. This informs us in our study design for COVID-19 in our EHR systems. Next slide. Thanks. Another factor that would inform our study design actually is the time when from test order to test results. And here you see that around 3/3 of it is from 1 to 2 days, but it can go as high as 9 to 10 days. So this helps us to think about our index state, what's our burn in terms of cohort, how do we identify our cohort, what's our person time. Next slide. So among other things that we're looking also at time varying factors here, and test volume since April to August within our EHRs here have been fairly consistent, with the highest test volume for those we are calling here older adults, which is above 50 years old, versus the younger adults and pediatrics. Next slide. However, out of all of those that has been tested, those that are positive, you find that the older adults would have the highest test positivity sometime until it reaches around July. And then you see that the younger adults and the pediatrics actually now have the highest test positivity. Next slide, thank you. Nonetheless, one of the biggest risk factor actually for hospitalization, and this is severe disease, is age. And both Rich and Steve have talked about the elderly population. So here, CBER has a project here in the nationally representative elderly population in the US of more than 30 million. On behalf of my colleagues, Heta Exureta, Yun Lu, and Rich Forshee, and other colleagues here, I'd like to present their work on looking at the risk factors for COVID-19 related hospitalization and risk of death in Medicare data. Next slide. Thanks. So the main study is in around 25 million elderly patients who are eligible for Medicare. And but this study is also large enough to look for risk factors within a population that is in nursing home, which is a population of interest, and also a population with end-stage renal disease, ERSD. I'll present some data actually on COVID-19 hospitalization within the 25 million elderly population. Next slide. You find that the risk, among others, risk factors is age, dual eligibility, and also ethnic minorities. Next slide. That result and also other results are summarized in publication is under review by Hector et al. Having spoken about all this preparatory work that we're doing, we've then applied that actually to two ongoing work that is on biologics for COVID-19. One is for treatment. Next slide. Thank you. And this is convalescent plasma. This is plasma for those who have recovered from COVID-19. We chose to work with an academic partner, Baylor Scott White Health, that is the largest nonprofit health hospital system in Texas, around 50, of which 27 of these sites are available as EHR in research quality in the Baylor Scott White Health Research Institute. We are estimating both the effectiveness and safety for this. Next slide. Thank you. We have around 700, actually 729 right now, and around 1,400. So we're comparing both those treated and those not treated for 28 days inpatient mortality as your primary outcome. We have other secondary outcomes also, and looking at transfusion-related adverse events as safety outcomes. This study is powered to detect a relative risk of more than 0.7, and that's around the effect size seen in randomized control trial for another drug for COVID-19, and that's dexamethasone. Next slide. Now, to control for confounding by indication, which is a big concern, as you would imagine, in terms of effectiveness for COVID-19 therapeutic, we are doing that both at design stage, and that is reset sampling for time-varying confounders And then we're also doing that at analysis, the list of list of covariates, data elements that's coming from directly sourced AHRs in the analysis that's using propensity scores. Next slide. So Steve has given you an overview of our vaccine work. This is a major activity for us. As Steve has mentioned, we are working now on master study protocols for both safety and effectiveness in both claims and AHR. Next slide. In terms of safety, as Steve has mentioned, we have a master study protocol working on that right now for sequential analysis. And this is to take different looks longitudinally at the data as the data accrues, in other words, as evidence accrues, and what are the methods to adjust for that. So in our study protocol, what I'd like to say here is that we are actually generating empirical data to inform our study design. One of it, for example, is background rates, and that's rates prior to vaccine introduction. There's concern that healthcare utilization may change due to the pandemic. So what are these rates if you're going to use them for historical controls for sequential analysis? And then another one is to look at what is our claims delay, which is what was mentioned at one time point here. So in Medicare, we have found that preliminary results is around 35 days to 70 days in inpatient and outpatient for the outcomes that Steve has mentioned thereabouts. And after the signals, we will be then verifying them in inferential studies. Depending on the type of information that we have gathered and data that we have gathered, then we will decide on the type of study designs that we'll be using. For effectiveness, as Steve had mentioned, the master protocol here will take into account the different types, what type of model of vaccine failure. Something to note, Steve mentioned the vaccine enhanced disease that actually can present itself as a vaccine failure rather than vaccine enhanced disease. Next slide. So in response to the pandemic, there are multiple COVID-19 activities that's ongoing now at CBER. Next slide. And thanks actually to a number, this long list of collaborators, particularly for vaccine surveillance. Names are not listed down here, they're actually by institutions because of a very long list here. And we'd like to thank our collaborators and partners for keeping pace with us for these COVID-19 activities. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Wheelie. Obviously, a lot of collaborators there too. So we just heard about a tremendous amount of work, and please do send your questions into Slido. We're going to try to get to a few of them here in the next few minutes. Tremendous amount of work ahead of some of the surveillance and other activities that are coming. And I guess it's like one question maybe to start with for Gerald and Steve. So heard about a lot of efforts underway around natural history of COVID and some of the associations with therapeutics and the like, a lot of prep work for further efforts around vaccines, both safety, those priority areas that you were describing, and effectiveness, and lots of collaborators on these efforts across CBER and CDER. My guess, though, is just given with the intense interest for obvious reasons in all of these issues related to COVID, are there some further plans to use the Sentinel infrastructure or others to share all this work that's going on with the broader community out there? I can imagine you're already working with a lot of these organizations, but as vaccines come along, as we have more experience with COVID, a lot of other groups may be interested in reporting on their own data and seeing how it fits into to what is happening here. I know in previous iterations, Sentinel has been really helpful for on questions of safety and increasing on effectiveness or other issues that people are interested in, providing that kind of overall framework and context and network for validation. So it just seems like COVID may be taking that to another level. Gerald, Steve, any comments about how this may be really a formative structure for thinking about these issues?
Yeah. So maybe if I could start and then turn it over to Steve. We're learning a lot as we do this. And I think that one of the challenges with COVID is we're studying a lot of hospitalized patients. And when you look back at the kind of safety work we've done, a lot of the safety work we've done over the years with claims data and in Sentinel has largely, not exclusively, but largely been in outpatients. Think of our work on the opioid epidemic, think of our work on diabetes, on contraceptives, other things like that, where we use hospital data in those, but that's usually an endpoint. Somebody got hospitalized because of a certain thing, like an MI, and that becomes the outcome. What happens in the hospital day by day isn't really the focus. Here, we're trying to figure out what happens in the hospital and how to find the right comparator group, how to find the right start date. What's the right way to do an index date? What's the right date? How do you pick a comparator? Somebody gets a medicine and somebody doesn't. When do you pick that comparator? What do you do if that person later on in the hospitalization gets the medicine? And to that end, it's been really helpful to have not only all of our collaborators who've been really helpful and thoughtful in this regard, but also have the evidence accelerator. I think that one of the presenters here in an earlier presentation mentioned the Reagan-Udall Foundation. The evidence accelerator has been, it's like going to a really good scientific meeting every week. Where we can discuss a lot of these problems. So I think a lot of what we're going to learn here is going to help us in other things. And then with regard to sharing, you know, some of our colleagues on this panel have presented at the Evidence Accelerator, but you know, it's a principle of Sentinel that we also share our findings and publicly post them. But I think we're going to, I think Sentinel has catalyzed a lot of what we were planning to do, and it's just forced us to do it at a little more rapid pace than we had thought of. Steve?
Yeah, so I'll echo a lot of the comments that you said, Gerald. I think technology and data access are really sort of changing the whole landscape of how we do business, and Sentinel's evolving, Best is evolving to kind of meet the changing technology. So I think it'll be critical to kind of figure out how best to apply that sort of new technology. And I think, you know, Evidence Accelerator is a great example. I think also like the transparency around posting protocols, sharing information will be really critical as well. And so, you know, when we post protocols, the idea is to get stakeholder feedback, but it's also so that those are available for use if people want to conduct studies as well. And so we can see a lot of potential for that. I think I'll stop there because I think we're running close to time.
Well, I appreciate the concise but very good answers. So we have gotten some questions in on Slido, and I want to thank all of our participants. One of them relates to the connection between all of the real world systems that you've talked about and the systems that are going to be used and have been used and now are being adapted, have been used in the past, now being adapted for tracking who gets COVID vaccines, how they're distributed, use the multiple doses in the case of vaccines that need 2 doses. Could you all comment on the connection between those databases, which are, I think, mainly building off CDC systems and state systems, to the various types of data that you've described? You know, if a person does get their vaccine in a healthcare context, it may show up in a claim, but I think this question goes to the issue of the fact that many people may get their vaccine through some other kind of field access, since we are in the middle of a public health emergency. How are those linkages working out?
So this is Steve Anderson. So I can say that we're working to make sure that there are potential linkages built. So it's really not only us, it's really CDC has responsibility in this area. So I think they're building sort of, you know, registry type potential systems for being able to track those, you know, administrations of vaccine. And you're right, Mark, I think a big challenge is that, you know, many of these vaccines won't be in healthcare systems unless we intentionally make our systems so that, for instance, you know, under an emergency use authorization, they'll be provided free, is my understanding. So how do we make sure those are recorded? So that'll be a big challenge. And I think CDC is working on that. But also I think we're trying to work on that with other partners like CMS to make sure at least like maybe the vaccine won't be recorded, but at least the vaccine administration will be recorded, that procedure, and that'll be recorded in order for somebody to get reimbursed for that procedure. So, and the other thing is coding too. So we're working with our partners on coding too, because it's complex. We're working on 2D barcoding issues, the national drug codes and how to implement those, getting CPT codes, CVS, MVS, HCPCS, and a variety of other codes. And we're working with our partners, CDC, VA, but also AMA has responsibility for CPT codes, CDC for the CVS codes, CMS for HCPCS, and so on. And so trying to have all of that in place so we can track these potential multiple vaccines.
And that's to have distinct coding for each vaccine, potentially each dose, that sort of thing.
Absolutely.
Okay, so sounds like some more work ahead there, but glad to see so much attention to it. Others on the panel, topics that you'd like to, or questions or comments that you'd like to make based on what you've heard as we work from what's really a tremendous amount of efforts already to a system that's going to be even more essential as we have more therapeutics, more diagnostic testing, and vaccines available. Any final thoughts? Hard to see this panel being speechless, but Jeff, maybe a comment from you. You talked in the beginning about preparedness for all of this. It seems like a lot coming together and a few pieces still to be fitted in.
Yeah, you know, and we touched on it. I think there's such an important space here for learnings across the groups. There's learnings across FDA and CDC, whatever they're doing. So we've used the Reagan-Udall Foundation to do that, but we really need to find a way to do this kind of broad-based sharing, because there's a whole set of the things we all need to do are the same. We all need validation studies. We all need kind of better algorithms for some outcomes. We want to learn from each other. We can't coordinate everything, right? We're all running really fast. So you can't make everything work perfectly, but if we can come up with ways of kind of sharing what the ongoing work and the planned work, so we don't bump into each other. And maybe one example is if we're going to be doing freshest feasible updates and linking to disease registries for the immunizations, and we're going to have all the same partners doing all of that. And we figure out, I mean, they'll scream, rightfully so, and we figure out how to coordinate some of that work. But simply figuring out how to do the sharing is going to be so important. And what we're doing today, it was really important to bring this out. And we got to keep it up, keep doing this.
Yeah, great. I think a great comment to end on after hearing about a tremendous amount of work that's gotten underway at, as they say these days, warp speed for addressing these important safety and effectiveness issues, and just understanding COVID using, I think as Steve Anderson said it, the data that's available now, the techniques for analyzing just so much better than ever before. And it's really just a question of making the most use for it. So I hope you all really appreciate the time you spent today. Maybe going to invite you all back to the next Sentinel annual update meeting, where hopefully we will have a lot to talk about on real progress and how these systems helped in understanding and making tremendous progress against this public health pandemic as the treatments and the vaccines and the better understanding disease really helps us move beyond it. So thank you all very much. And with that, I'd like to turn to our final session of the afternoon, our fireside chat. I think another form of a keynote with Amy Abernethy. Amy is the Principal Deputy Commissioner at FDA, as I mentioned in my opening remarks ahead of this session. And Amy, maybe I want to pick up on some of the topics that came up around COVID and developing evidence, and you heard mentioned the role of the evidence accelerator, something I know that you've been really critical in advancing. But before we get to COVID, you, before coming to FDA, were an expert in many of these issues related to real world data and developing evidence. And you've been familiar with what's happened with the Sentinel Initiative over the past decade plus. So maybe you could just start with a few of the observations that come first to mind for you in thinking about what Sentinel's accomplished and looking ahead to the future before we focus in on COVID issues.
So first of all, thank you very much for having me. I think, Mark, I get to see you on Zoom, and that's about it these days, which is probably how we feel with all of our work colleagues these days. Sentinel in the past, as I reflect over the last decade plus, there's been some critical work that had to be done and was done. The first of which is really around building trust. Trust from sort of all sides and all participants that a mechanism such as Sentinel that leverages real world data, that is analyzing around somebody else's medical product and is providing information to the FDA is something that can be done in a transparent and trustworthy way. And that, I think, was a really important foundational step to get us to the place where we can even have the conversations we're having today. And so that would be the first thing I'd say. Now, as I think has come out in many different ways, that work is not done. Continuing to advance transparency principles is really important. But I think that was one of the critical things that happened in the past. And that trust not only came from showcasing what it might look like if we have a Sentinel program, but also what are methods that we can rely on. How can we really be thoughtful about rigorous study design, about identification of data sets that can be fit for purpose, about being honest when data sets don't really stand up to the task that we have that we need, and we need to either not really put real world data to work within the context of that particular problem or go and find other data. So really being very thoughtful about getting the methods right. And I think those foundational elements for Sentinel get us to this particular place, and really cannot be. They're so important.
Yeah, and just to tie some of the broader work going on at FDA that you've been helping to lead, FDA's strategy on real world evidence generally has highlighted exactly the points that you mentioned, the importance of understanding data and having trust in the data, that it's fit for purpose, understanding the methods, and that they're being brought to bear effectively. Do you see Sentinel playing a critical role in kind of driving this broader real world evidence agenda forward at the agency?
Yeah, so the answer is absolutely and yes. The interesting thing here, Mark, is as I look across the real world data work happening, I see Sentinel being a leader in many ways. But I think the most important way, and we're seeing this happen right now in Evidence Accelerator, but we're seeing it across the real world data space, is not only a key mechanism to get the work done, but also a leader as sage and wise advisor. Really, the organization and the thought leaders who have shaped, here is a high quality, credible approach to doing this work. And not only do we have an approach that you can look to and try and mimic if you're another organization doing work in the real world data space, or you are a manufacturer, the FDA needs to rely on Sentinel's work, but also we've traveled hard roads. We have experienced the pitfalls, including where data are going to work for us and where they're not, where we're going to need to go out and curate data in new ways. And we actually have that experience that we can bring to the table as we contemplate trying to solve new problems like we're doing right now in COVID-19. So I see Sentinel's role as both sort of a foundational engine, but also sage advisor.
Yeah, so I want to talk a bit about COVID-19. I know you've been doing a lot of work there too, but specifically, maybe you could start with an introduction for people who may be with us and who aren't active participants, at least yet, in the evidence accelerator work. Gerald Delpan mentioned it earlier and talked about it being a kind of, I think it was, to paraphrase him, a weekly masterclass in some of the methods and data analytic approaches that are being used to bring a lot of expertise both in and out of the agency to bear on key questions related to COVID therapeutics and diagnostics. Maybe just a little bit of introduction and where what the evidence accelerators are doing and where that work stands.
Okay, so it seems like forever ago, March 2020, but you can imagine that in March, we were really, as FDA, but I think the entire healthcare community, and including the Sentinel community, was asking the question, oh my goodness, how are we going to get our head around this slowly moving but massively important pandemic sitting right in front of us? And how are we going to really start to tell the story of what is COVID-19 and also try and understand what may work with respect to healthcare interventions, et cetera. And so this was really an effort to try and figure out how do we get all of the actors to the table, groups who have data, groups who are historically potentially not at the table, including health tech companies, researchers, government organizations, industry, health systems, to start to see, can we bring data and analytic solutions to bear in service of COVID-19. Now, one of the really important organizations coming to the table without question was Sentinel. And the question wasn't, how do we do this without Sentinel, or how is Sentinel not going to meet the needs, but actually a recognition that there was such a massive need sitting in front of us that there wasn't enough bandwidth in any one place to get all that work done. And how can we actually start to really leverage every resource available to try and answer the question? So that was the original task. And in order to do that, we leveraged a lot of the kinds of ideas and capabilities that you see across Sentinel. So one is, identifying common data elements. Two is identifying common ways of having standardized case definitions and the ability to understand how variables are also going to perform across different data sets. But the other thing that I think that we did that was particularly important was identify a common list of questions that matter, and now start to understand who all can participate in answering those questions. And then ask ourselves, in order to start answering those questions, what else do we need? And this goes back to Gerald's comment about the masterclass. We need essentially really efficient mechanisms to learn from each other how to do this work really well in the context of COVID-19. How do we quickly understand which patient is a COVID patient? How do we start to define something like a long hauler? How do we now start to think about common methods for analysis and learn from each other within that context? And so what we realized was one of the things that was going to be really important here was to bring to the table continuous learning cycles where we could continuously learn from each other, both from the standpoint of the data and the methods, as well as potential new solutions and technologies. The last thing I'll say here is that what's happened is that we've been learning from each other in a way that we can put to service in COVID-19. Sentinel has continued to be really, as I mentioned, sort of the sage and wise advisor, as well as a key mechanism through which a lot of this work is happening. And I think that what we're going to continue to see happen here is surfacing of new ways of working together like this now and into the future through this type of model.
Yeah, and so to tie it back to our last session, Sentinel and the best infrastructure, the Sentinel partners are obviously going to be playing a critical role in some of the very important public health, real world evidence issues ahead related to things like learning more about the natural history of COVID and how different kinds of treatments or patient characteristics may be associated with it, and particularly around the therapy therapeutics that may be coming, some fairly soon, and the vaccines that may be coming. We heard from the last panel, I think building on exactly your point about the importance of not only the Sentinel and the FDA efforts in partnership with the rest of the federal government doing that well, but bringing in additional outside partners. Based on what you've seen happen through the evidence accelerator so far, any suggestions or tips about how to make sure that sharing of experience and of emerging best practices and evidence, lessons learned can really take place effectively?
Sure. So the first I would say is that when solutions have already been worked out, so when, for example, we've developed methods to identify the COVID-19 patient or to identify oxygen therapy and quantify oxygen therapy, when those methods have been developed, let's not keep trying to redevelop them. Let's now codify that and have those as foundational building blocks that we can share around and use, from Sentinel into BEST, from Sentinel BEST into other networks that exist in the COVID-19 real world data space. So those sort of foundational building blocks are really important, and let's not redo it. The second thing that I would say is that what we've learned in the evidence accelerator, and certainly we've known through Sentinel and other efforts, is that there's a really important opportunity to use different data sets analyzed similarly to compare and contrast how medical interventions are performing, or even just the natural history of COVID-19 in the context of different health systems, in different healthcare delivery scenarios, and all of sort of the different underlying matrices that really are part of our healthcare delivery system, and then also contribute to the data sets, and therefore contribute to the kind of findings we're seeing in our real world data studies. And so I think that this idea of having multiple parallel analyses at times can be really helpful to us, and we should be learning from that and understanding where there's repetition and what is consistent, as well as when there's divergent findings, what does that mean? And what does that tell us about the differences, for example, in the underlying healthcare delivery systems? I think that's the second thing. The third thing is that there is more work, honestly, than any one small team can do, or even huge teams. And so figuring out how we parse out the work is going to be really important. And then the last thing is that still comes with some real risks. And one of those risks is that we end up with the same patient represented in multiple different data sets. And so figuring out how we deal with these issues that come from multiple data sets, or multiple teams working with the same data set, or multiple patients being represented in the same data set, are the kinds of things that we're going to have to make sure that we attend to along the way.
Well, that's actually my next question. If you could expand on that a little bit. So based on the work that's happened so far, there is it's only been since March, but there's already a very strong foundation. And we heard about a lot of the work today and more that's happening in the evidence accelerator around things like standard master protocols for understanding natural history of COVID, ways of capturing important adverse outcomes. We heard Vin's presentation about thrombotic events, for example, and for some of the treatments that have already been authorized, and emergency use authorization is keep reminding people this is what it was built for, which may not be exactly the same evidence standards, especially for patients who are at very high risk and where there's some confidence about the safety of a product. Lots of need for the real world evidence development and a good foundation for many outcomes, both adverse events and outcomes related to having identifying COVID infections and identifying complications that therapeutics would be intended to avoid. But there are still some challenges ahead. You mentioned one, dealing with potentially duplicative data. I'm not sure if you've got further thoughts on how to deal with that one. I wanted to highlight a couple of others that came up in the previous sessions. One is linkage between the databases that FDA's been using extensively for the post-market surveillance in Sentinel and the databases that are going to be used to capture the use of a vaccine. So those vaccine registries, is linking those to post-market real-world data systems is not new for FDA, but it's going to be, I think, a different scale of challenge here with potentially a lot of vaccination happening outside of usual healthcare, especially early on when there will be limited use and probably staged access with a lot of tight HHS, CDC, DOD involvement in getting those vaccines to the highest risk individuals. Can we connect those back to these same data systems? And then issues related to identifying when vaccines are really used and which one. So if the vaccines are delivered in a healthcare context, as Steve was pointing out, do we have the HCPCS code, the CPT codes, the CVS codes, the ones that are needed to identify a particular vaccine when we may have multiple and a couple of doses and so forth. Those do seem like challenges that still lie ahead, and ones where, again, this kind of everybody working together is going to be important to address them. Any thoughts to add on that? Any other watch outs that you think we should be aware of and planning for now, or any thoughts about how to address these?
So my heart beats fast as you start to describe those. They're so important. I think that there are a number of watch outs here, and the one that you've just identified, which is identifying which vaccine or which intervention the patient has received and when, and then being able to link that particular individual back to all the different potential data sources around that individual is a critical task. And my first thought there is, not only name the problem, we need to start working on it now, and we need to make sure that teams are working on the how to, and that feels like a very important near-term task. Similarly, another really critical task here, you just heard Gerald mention how big of a difference and a big shift it was to move from the traditional mechanisms that Sentinel has been used for, which are predominantly, outpatient systems, claims-based, to needing really deep, rich information coming in from electronic health records and other data sets. We certainly have learned a lot more about how to do that over the last 6 months, but continuing to do the hard work to codify COVID severity, to understand what adverse events patients are receiving and be able to clearly notate those so we have consistent information. Like, that hard work is really important to do early, because we don't want to be waiting to be down the road and then not have done the work to make sure that our results are trustworthy when suddenly we really need those results in near real time. So those are the kind of things that I think are kind of critical for us to work on right now. And, you hit on this other point, which is, all hands on deck and people working on this together, which means we need to have these mechanisms like today's meeting, right, where people are talking to each other, because it's really important for us to parse out who's working on what and cross-check each other, so that we go back to the foundational element of Sentinel, which was this issue of trust and transparency and making sure we've got the methods right. And that's going to be something we really need to be able to use these mechanisms for right now.
Well, so some busy days ahead for Sentinel Best and the Evidence Accelerator, but it is really nice to have these unprecedented kinds of capabilities to help with the real world evidence that can enable us to get through the pandemic more effectively. Now let's look a little bit longer out, if you can see beyond COVID. Amy, you were instrumental in the FDA's technology strategy, which envisions a future that I think is, I don't know how you would put it, but the Sentinel system has been built on this principle of distributed data, and the world's largest, or one of the world's largest, distributed data and analysis networks. And we're seeing an explosion in the potential data that could be brought to bear through distributed systems or other mechanisms to enable much richer analyses both to maybe to augment or reform the way that we do clinical trials, as well as to do much more sophisticated observational studies that bring in data from patients, data from other sources. Just some final comments about the vision that you see for the future of developing evidence and how Sentinel can fit into that.
So, you know, as you were describing that evolving vision, one of the things that is an important feature is it's not any one thing, right? So there are distributed query systems like Sentinel. So essentially the ability to work in federated models is very, very important. There's also opportunities to bring more data in-house, and some of our technology modernization activities at the agency are activities like building data lakes and building the analytic capabilities from multiple parts of the agency to work with the same data and learn from each other. There are other parts of how data are going to be used where, for example, clinical trials data sets and real world data sets will be concatenated, either really sort of in a totality of the evidence approach where it's clinical trials plus real world data, or for one individual person record where some of the information is coming in from formalized clinical trials and some information is coming in from more passively collected real world data systems like electronic health records. So there's a lot of different ways that these pieces are going to come together. It's therefore going to be really important that we truly understand data characteristics. I think that's been one of the conversations brewing in Sentinel, is characterizing data, recognizing that it's not just data quality, it's the characteristics of the data and how we can put data to task for different elements, and being really, really clear about what system is being used for which task and why, and also being very parsimonious. There may always be the best system we could use for everything, but if we are only using that one system, then we lose some of the mosaicism we can get from other systems, and we really need to be able to rely on that larger vision of data coming from multiple places, which again gives us much more of the sort of full picture with all of the opportunities and warts that goes along with how we can use data in these multiple different ways. The last thing I would say is COVID-19 has taught us, and I think you saw some of this in today's Sentinel meeting, that it's really important that we use data to answer all our questions, not just the questions that are the ones that are around, for example, trying to move towards causal inference, but even the most basic descriptive questions and being able to answer them quickly so that all of our decision making is information informed.
Yeah, well, it's a great point to end on. Out of all of these points, bringing together a whole increasingly clear and vivid, comprehensive picture. It's a great vision that you're contributing to at FDA, Amy. And I want to thank you for your leadership and for joining us this afternoon. It's been great talking with you again. And with that, we are just about done. I have a few more comments that I'd like to make if you bear with us for a few minutes. And those mainly relate to thanking everyone who's been involved in this effort, starting off with all of you who joined. As you've heard, Sentinel works because it is a public-private collaboration. The bigger that network, the better connected it is, the more that we share ideas across it, the more powerful it becomes. And we appreciate your contributions and hope you got some new ideas, thoughts, new directions that you can take away from today's meeting to help us build out a better real-world evidence system and fulfill the ever expanding mission of Sentinel. I'd also like to thank our panelists for today's sessions. As you heard, they are people at FDA especially are very busy these days. They're very busy every day, but particularly in the midst of a pandemic, and for them to take the time out to help put together this comprehensive update, fit in not only COVID-19, but the bigger picture for the short and long term. We really appreciate their taking the time to do that, as well as all of the Sentinel collaborators and key investigators that you heard from today as well. Special thanks to the people at the FDA who helped us put this meeting together. Bob Ball, Steve Anderson, Rich Platt, Josh Gagney, Asif Dar, Stephen Nabinger, Benjamin Stratton, who put in a lot of time to make this event go as smoothly as possible in the virtual era. And also a very special thanks to Michael Nguyen, who's made many contributions to get this event to be a success, along with Jamila Mwadu. Last, I'd like to thank our team at Duke Margolis, Adam Atten, Adam Croach, Mira Gill, Marta Wazinska, Luke Durocher, and Patty Green for all of their efforts to organize the workshop and the interactions and communication support that we had. And again, ending where I started, thank you all for being here today. Thanks for all you're doing to help advance evidence and help with the shared mission of this public-private collaboration that is the Sentinel Initiative. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of the afternoon and take care.